Hello everyone, this is Moth with Death Comedy Gems, but it's going to look a little different this time around. I want to talk about Patrice O'Neal, but instead of going into his life, career, and his contributions to comedy, I'm going to switch it up for a few reasons. I started a few different scripts for this project, but I ended up scrapping them because honestly, unlike Carlin and Mooney before, I don't think Patrice O'Neal has really contributed all that much to the medium of comedy. Most of what he is known for was not set on stage, he didn't have many specials, he didn't appear in a ton of film or television. Honestly, his spirit and name are not really being carried forward by lovers of comedy, but rather by a certain section of the internet that found his quote-unquote dating advice to be profound. Which is a shame on so many levels because first and foremost, Patrice was funny. Patrice was skilled at the craft of comedy, at least some of his peers respected him, but he's not really a great. He wasn't the pillar of the community, black, comedic, or otherwise. Really, he was the template or prototype for what we would call today red pill or manosphere. And if we're being honest, I would argue that he was also a massive Sly Cooper fan, even more than he was a misogynist, if you get what I'm saying. Patrice is not really fun to talk about once you get into the weeds of his personality, ideologies, and his life, and if I'm honest, that's probably why it took me so long to make this. I even bought a copy of his book and the book of his fiancée, Vaughn DeCarlo Brown. I was going to go into his past, but that's already been done pretty well elsewhere, and I'll link the clip to some of those videos down below. I was going to go through and highlight different things in his book, but that started to feel gross and unproductive. I'm not sure how much can be learned from over-examining such negative material when he doesn't have the creative output to back it up. Performers, especially comedians, say and do terrible shit all the time, but they usually leave a body of work behind, whether that work is good or whether it's bad. Speaking of good or bad, as I was slapping together this script, Kevin Hart had his roast, and instead of using him as a juxtaposition to Patrice O'Neal, I had to rewrite this part to bring up how his body of work, while robust and varied, is full of as much fuckery as there are nuggets of gold. Of the many friends that O'Neal had in the comedy world, Hart was one of his closest, possibly only trumped by one other figure I'll get to in a second. The double dealing that Kevin Hart has to do, keeping both black and white audiences happy with his performances, is something that Patrice could not and would not do, but that's not for any noble reason. Kevin kind of goes the route of always trying to please people and never really giving his opinion on anything publicly so that he can soak up as much money as possible, and this is all a problem in and of itself, but for every poorly written, slapped together production he's a part of, he still either puts people on, pays the way for a lot of comedians, and occasionally is a part of great projects like Fight Night from a couple years ago. Side note, I had most of this shit written and ready to record when not only did this roast drop, but FD Signifier also has already had time to chime in, and I hope it doesn't sound like I'm just parroting him. Some of this critique is right there to be commented on, but man's beat me to the punch. I'll be kind of responding to one thing he said in a minute, not to counter-argue or anything, just to give a different perspective. Going back to Patrice, you could paint the lack of trajectory in his career in two different ways. On the one hand, you can say that he never wanted to be a huge star unless it meant he could tell jokes the way he wanted and to whom he wanted to tell them to. In that regard, he's similar to the godfather of black comedy, Paul Mooney. However, when Mooney decided to stick to his guns, he didn't sell his people out. He didn't try to ingratiate himself with so-called edgy comedians, and his particular flavor of misogyny was still bad, but it didn't become a significant component of his personality or his stand-up. In fact, Patrice O'Neal kind of dissed Paul Mooney's stance on not wanting to be a token or a Sambo, saying something to the effect of Chappelle quitting his show back in 2004 was because of the influence of people like Paul Mooney. People will focus a lot on how O'Neal was hateful towards women, and while he put a lot of his comedic energies into that, the thing that struck me more after combing through all the clips from Opie and Anthony, the Black Phillip Show, and his book was how much he had a very clear dislike for black people in general. Or at the very least, he was willing to constantly field racist arguments about black people in front of and for clearly racist people. If Patrice O'Neal loved nothing else, he loved being the token black friend in a room full of white chuds. David Lucas is currently floundering in this lane that Patrice paved the way for. FD postulates that this tactic of black creatives seeking white approval so that their art can be made is a symptom of the post-racial world that Obama made. But I'd argue that Patrice is patient zero for this movement, and his sentiments predate Obama. Patrice was not a total ring rodent. He had critiques and frustrations with white America, many of his complaints being something that most black people would agree with, but he also had a lot of hatred for his own people. He didn't really exist within the political dichotomy of liberal versus conservative or left wing versus right wing, so that gave him the illusion of being either an enlightened centrist or an intellectual that's just above it all. Really, Patrice was just a misanthrope fueled by his self-hatred, and he mostly lashed out at whoever was around until they proved to be able to withstand his tirades. The plot thickens and becomes opaque when we look at his best friend. His closest friend by many accounts was Bill Burr. Bill Burr is maligned right now due to the Saudi Comedy Festival, but honestly, once you comb through a lot of his racial material is not really all that bad. And in fact, you can say he easily has more respect for black people than Patrice ever did. And before someone says it, a lot of Bill's racial jokes were made before and after he married his wife Nia, so I don't think this is a situation of him switching up once he married his sister. How is it that one of the most anti-black black comedians had a white friend who made more racially conscious material than he did? Some might take the cynical view and say that maybe Burr is just a closeted racist and that he hides it, but I've listened to a lot of his podcasts over the years and he's really never given me that vibe. I'll have to go back and check some Opie and Anthony clips when he dies. Everyone's skeletons walk the earth when they die. Anyways, the fact that so much of Patrice's legacy is reported like secondhand by his friends and his compatriots speaks to the polarizing but ultimately limited level of impact he had on the comedy world. Following in his footsteps could lead you to being a straight up sellout, a passive racism apologist, a true believer in what comedians think is freedom of speech but is actually just wanting freedom from consequences. You could be a seminal figure of black comedy history and tradition, or you can be an overall inconsistent flip-flopping motherfucker. The sad truth is that whatever angle you take to view Patrice, you could be varying degrees of right or wrong, but honestly you will never be satisfied with what you find, and I think that was Patrice's greatest fear, not being enough no matter what direction he committed his efforts toward. Despite what many comedians would have you think, they don't get to decide what funny is in a vacuum. Comedy is a negotiation between the crowd and the act. You can push, press, stretch, and stress out a crowd, but you can't just repeatedly beat them over the head and tell them that it's a hug. Comedy is not supposed to be a hostage situation, and Stockholm Syndrome is not killing. Making people leave because your jokes are fucked up is not a badge of honor. It's a fucking cry for help and is attention-seeking behavior. Patrice O'Neal is not really a legend. I'll give him the credit of having legend potential, but you have to make it all come together. And what that means for comedians is shaping your material to be more accessible. By accessible, I don't mean trying to make a bunch of clean comedy with sanitized jokes and no bite. Trimming away some of the more out there parts of a set is not settling or pandering. It means you care more about making people laugh than anything else. Hell, I'd even argue that in his 2011 special, Elephant in the Room, that he's a much more palatable version of his usual self in that show. It's annoying to see that he was capable of so much more, but he held himself back. If you will permit me to play armchair psychologist just a little longer, I genuinely think that Patrice O'Neal hated himself deep down and compensated for it with lashing out on stage and other maladaptive behaviors. He was a large black man who grew up in the Boston area, so the ingrained racial denigration component is already there. He was raised by a single mother who still wanted to live a life despite having 2 kids, and he mentioned at some point having a certain, somewhat small amount of resentment towards her for that. Quick shout out to all the single mothers and fathers who get blamed for every fucking thing because they're the ones who are around to do shit. Niggas will blame all types of shit on the one parent who actually pours into them on a daily basis, but ignore the impact of the one motherfucker who is nowhere to be found. Irks the shit out of me. Sorry, back on track. There's also the fact that Patrice was sent to prison early in his life for statutory rape, which if you look into it, everyone was fucked up in that situation. I'm not diving any deeper into that. Again, watch the video that I'll link below and make up your own mind about how you feel about that one. The point I'm trying to drive home is that between his outward presentation and the environment he was raised in, it was fertile ground to grow an anti-black, incelish, pickup artist, woman-hating, self-sabotaging dude, and clearly it did just that. Nobody wants to hear this because many just want to send people to jail and throw away the key, but Patrice should have went to fucking therapy or at least some sort of mentorship program instead of prison. And maybe would have not only become a better person or a better comedian, but actually been happy in his life and not felt the need to go to Brazil for prostitutes or deal with women in less than equal manner in general. I said I wasn't going to go into all this stuff about him and his personal life and his history, but While so much of who Patrice O'Neal was lends itself to fascinating study in how people become who they are, all this shit isn't really about comedy. He is interesting as a person, but as a comic, there's so much that was left on the table by the time he dies in 2011. Cam James made a video about Patrice a little while ago, and he had summed up so much about him that I would have wanted to go over. But the one bit of difference that I can add to that he couldn't, is that I also grew up in a place where my identity was primed for denigration and to leave me with deep feelings of self-loathing and self-hatred. I empathize with the issues that O'Neal faced in his youth because I have personally faced many of these same issues, and I even experienced some of this persistent demonization to this day, especially from the community that I love and want to support. If there is one gem I want people to hold on to with this video, it's that letting your past traumas and hardships be the only thing that informs your perspectives on life is counterproductive, and it isn't healing or helping you. Don't forget them and attempt to hold the people and systems accountable who contributed to those hardships and traumas, but I would say that it's important not to live and die by their accountability or culpability. There is more to life than your one singular experience, and being blinded by your pain alone is what leads to perpetual cycles of destruction and sadness. Patrice could have meant more to others if his life meant more to himself. And for all I could say about him with his fiancée Vonda Brown, I'll just leave it at they loved each other, and it seemed to be the one relationship that he allowed as best he could to mean something truly transcendent and enriching. Careers don't always start or end clean, but they do end. Some of them shorter lived than others. I'm not promoting people working themselves into the ground or hustling to the day they die. Instead, what I think is another great takeaway from Patrice's lack of comedic production is that we don't know how much time any of us have left on this earth. So if we're going to do work, let it be something that we can be proud of, and not just a stack of pages and tape about gender wars nonsense that's low-key just screaming for someone to care about you. We all have at least one person who should care about us, and that's ourselves. Build from that. No matter what, you'll always have a community of at least one. Well, that's all for me today. This is Moth with Death Comedy Gems. I'll be back hopefully sooner rather than later with the next video on Sam Kinison. Have a good one. Goodbye.